believe when you come from a country where Christianity has produced violence? Well, there are many answers to that, but the first is that I first experienced the Christian faith through my parents, and they were very unusual because they were Christian without being sectarian. My father had a store. He employed perhaps 30, 40 people. And he tried to employ equally Protestants and Catholics. He got bombed for that. My brother nearly lost his life when a bomb tore part of his face off and an eye. And I said to my father, "Why do you do this? Why do you run the risk?" He said, "Listen, I believe a statement that occurs right at the beginning of the ancient book of Genesis that tells us that human beings, whatever they believe, all of them, are made in the image of God. And therefore, I must treat them equally, whatever they believe. And that is why I employ equally." That has lived with me until today, because it gave me the base of a value system. And I've never found one to equal it, that tells me that you have infinite value because you're made in the image of God. That impressed me greatly, because their faith in God and Christ was real. It wasn't pretended, it wasn't nominal, it was real. The second thing is, and again this was unusual, our country sadly had a lot of bigotry and religious prejudice and so on. But my parents loved me enough to allow me to think. They gave me space. And I say they loved me enough to give me space, because many of my contemporaries, when they got to university, of course, their Christian faith being unreal and nominal disappeared in a couple of days. Mine did not. So that was the beginning. But you see, when I got to Cambridge, something happened very early that it changed my life in a way. And it just happened at dinner time in my college. A student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, sorry. I forgot you are Irish. And all you Irish believe in God and you fight about it." I'd heard that many times. But then the question came. Here I've got a unique opportunity to test the validity of my Christian worldview. So on that day, I decided to make friends of people who did not share my worldview. And I have spent the last 56 years doing that. Getting to know people, what they believe, why they believe it. Why? Well, one reason was just because I'm interested in other people. But the second reason is I wanted to test what I believed, because it was not enough for me simply that my parents were credible Christians. I was interested in the truth question, and always have been. Is Christianity true or not? And one way of discovering that is to open yourself to being questioned. And that really is why I did a lot of traveling before most of you were born. I spent a lot of time behind the Iron Curtain. You may have heard of it. And I speak German and I speak Russian, and those two languages helped me to gain access to see the effect of atheism in culture. particularly in the German Democratic Republic and Russia and Ukraine. And I've made many visits over since 1970s during the Cold War. And all of that, I feel, was a preparation for, in the West then, challenging some of my intellectual colleagues at Oxford and around the world on their atheism. So that really is the background to what I do.
Wonderful stories, Professor Lennox. Thank you for sharing them. Before you start, we are very fortunate that few of your books have been translated in Romanian, and I have a few of them here. And if you be so kind to just tell us a few words about each of them, because they will be available outside.
Sure. Well, I must say, I am massively impressed with my Romanian friends who, on Tuesday in Cluj, handed me these books which they just finished printing. And the most important one for this evening is the book that carries the title of the lecture, Poate Stința explica totul, as you will know. So this lecture tonight is going to be a kind of introduction to the thinking that lies behind this book. But then there are several other books. Some years ago, I wrote a much more in-depth book on science and God. And this one is called Has Science Buried God? So it's a similar book, but much more detailed. And then, because many people, when they hear I'm a Christian, they raise questions about the early chapters of Genesis and science. And I understand those questions. And I've written a book to try to help people navigate between the ancient Near Eastern stories that appear at the beginning of Genesis and the current views of cosmology and so on. And this is called 7 Days That Divide the World. And then finally, this book, which is rather thick, is dedicated to a very important question, which in our society is being discussed ever more. And the question is this: are we determined? Are we determined either by the basic atomic, physical, and chemical structure of our lives based on the laws of nature? Or are we determined by a micromanaging God? Or is it somewhere in between or not at all? So the age-old discussion between God's control, whatever it may be, of history and individual life, and our personal freedom and responsibility is the subject of this book, which is called Determined to Believe. Finally, next spring, a book will appear called 2084. You may remember George Orwell's book 1984. Well, my book is 2084. Artificial Intelligence, the Future of Humanity and the God Question. And of course, because there's huge interest in AI and books by people like Yuval Noah Harari, I found it fascinating developing these ideas. So that's something about my books.
Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. Just allow me to address a few words in Romanian for the audience, and then the stage is yours. Aș vrea să vă adresez rugămintea ca în timpul prelegerii să închidem telefoanele mobile și, bineînțeles, să păstrăm liniștea și respectul față de invitatul nostru. Mulțumesc, Professor Jonas. We are listening.
Very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, can science explain everything? And apparently this technology can't explain anything. Ah, very good. Those pictures are not very clear, but they're pictures of a debate that has become somewhat famous, that I held with Richard Dawkins in the Natural History Museum in Oxford, which is the place where in 1860 there was a famous debate between Bishop Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley on Darwin's book, Origin of Species. And if you look carefully, you will see that Dawkins and I are seated, and between us is the massive skeleton of Tyrannosaurus rex. And it was quite terrifying because we felt that this might collapse on us at any time. The bottom picture on your left is a debate I had at the Edinburgh Festival with the late Christopher Hitchens on the topic, "The New Europe Needs the New Atheism." You can see all of these online, and let me tell you just now about my website, which is johnlennox.org. johnlennox.org. Now, can science explain everything? Bertrand Russell was a very famous philosopher, and Bertrand Russell once said, "Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." Now, Russell was a mathematician and a logician, but I'm sorry to say that his logic failed when he wrote that sentence. Because, is that a statement of science? No. So if this sentence is correct, you cannot know that it is true. It is logically incoherent because it contains an inner contradiction. Perhaps it's too late at night for logic, but there it is. It's extreme and it's false. It's logically incoherent. But there's an expression of what we nowadays call scientism. The idea that science, that is the natural sciences, can explain everything. Of course, if you go back etymologically, science in English comes from scire in Latin, to know. And if you simply take it at that level, it means knowledge. And of course it can explain everything because explanation simply leads to knowledge. But we're talking about the current widespread idea that natural sciences can explain everything. And one of the people who espouses that idea is the late Stephen Hawking, who has not appeared. But there he is. And he wrote a book called The Grand Design, which is very interesting because, like everybody else, he looks at the universe and he sees at least apparent design. His book is an attempt to explain it without invoking God. And when I first looked at this book, I was very interested to see he started with a collection of big questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Why do we exist? Why this particular set of laws and not some other? Why is there something rather than nothing? And of course, when I read that, I thought this is going to be extremely interesting to hear one of the most brilliant cosmologists of our age talking about these things. But surprisingly, right near the beginning of his book, he says that the answers, well, let me read it to you. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Scientism again. But this is a very strange statement. Philosophy is dead. You could imagine that the philosophy department in Cambridge was not happy. And they wrote about it. And in fact, some philosophers were very amused at this statement for a very obvious reason. Because most of Hawking's book is about what? It's about the philosophy of science. And to write philosophy is dead at the beginning of a book on philosophy of science is rather foolish. And when we look at his big questions and ask ourselves, which of those questions can science answer? Very few of them, in fact. Certainly, science gives us understanding, some understanding of the world and the behavior of the universe. But does it tell us what the nature of reality is and where all this came from? And does the universe need a creator? Does it tell us why we exist? Well, there are many distinguished scientists who would say it gives partial answers to some of these questions. But perhaps the most important of these people was a famous Peter Medawar, a very famous Nobel Prize winner in Oxford. He says science is clearly limited. It cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of life? So the next thing we come across is the worldview tension that exists in the academy in many parts of the world. And that is the tension that is between oh dear. I think it might be better if somebody else worked this, because I can't see it, you see, behind me. I don't know what you're watching, and this is not working properly. Yeah, well, I'm okay. I'm pressing very hard. There we are. We'll do our best. What we should be looking at now is a comparison of the two polar opposite worldviews of naturalism and theism. They're polar opposites because naturalism, which is the dominant worldview in the academy today, particularly in the West, the universe is all that exists. Ultimate reality is, well, several possibilities, mass, energy, a quantum vacuum, or even nothing. And secondly, when it comes to explaining things, by definition, there is no top, there is no divine causation, so the universe must explain itself bottom up, reductionistically in terms of physics and chemistry. And finally, many naturalist scientists believe the universe gives no evidence of God. Theism says the exact opposite. First of all, the universe is not all that exists. There is a God who created it and sustains it. Ultimate reality is not physical, it's God who is spirit. And the universe explanation is much more sophisticated. It involves both top-down and bottom-up causation. And the universe does give evidence of God. Now, what people think in general, certainly in my country and in many other countries, is that science conflicts with God as explanation for our universe. And people like Stephen Hawking ask us to choose between the two. But if we look at the next picture, we will see two Nobel Prize winners for physics. One is Stephen Weinberg, and the other is Charles Townes. There's no difference between these men as scientists. They're both geniuses. But there is a difference between them. Stephen Weinberg is an atheist. Charles Townes is a Christian. And this is enough to tell us that it is far too simplistic to think that the conflict is between science and God. It is not. The conflict is between theism and atheism, or theism and naturalism. And there are top scientists on both sides. Now that changes the parameters of the debate. And we can see this when we ask the next question. Where does science fit then? Does it point towards naturalism, atheism? Or does it point towards theism? Or does it not point towards anything at all? Now, in attempting to answer that question, first of all, we run into a fog or a mist. I call it an intellectual fog. Let me illustrate it by Stephen Hawking's statement made in one of our national newspapers. Religion is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark. I was asked to comment on this, and seeing this was a very short statement, I decided to make a very short statement in reply. So I said that atheism was a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, which of those is true? Well, actually, they're simply statements of personal belief. He said it, he's a scientist. It's not a statement of science. My answer was a statement of my personal belief. It's not a statement of science. We have to be very clear that statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. Why I say that is this. When Stephen Hawking says, there is no God, that's simply a statement of his personal belief. But because he is huge scientific authority, people think that this statement has the authority of science, which it does not. I love the quotation by Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman. He said, outside their field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. And that's true. And therefore, we have to think very hard and ask ourselves, how do we answer these questions? What are our sources of evidence? And I want to cite, as you see, 3 sources of evidence. First of all, the history of science. Secondly, the nature and philosophy of science. And thirdly, the results of science. Evidence is a very important concept because so many people today think that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there is no evidence. I want to make very clear to you tonight that faith is an ordinary word. In English, it comes from the Latin fides, trust. And when it comes to belief, faith and trust, which are all essentially the same, the first question that we have the right to ask is, why do you trust that? Why do you believe that? Why do you accept that? And in answer, we give evidence. If you have an apartment and you go to borrow money from the bank, and you say to the bank manager, please trust me, how far will you get? He'll say, well, of course I will, but what evidence have you got that you can pay for this mortgage? And that's the way life is. That is, faith and evidence go together. And faith is only valid if there is strong enough evidence to support it. So now let's start with science. And this is something many people do not realize, that faith is essential to science. In fact, it's essential to any discipline whatsoever, and in most of everyday life. Let's think of the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. C.S. Lewis, writing about it, said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. Now that is fascinating to me. And actually, it gave me a huge interest in modern science. Let's look at some of them. First of all, there's a statement by a brilliant ancient historian in Australia who says Christianity, or above all, the biblical doctrine of creation, is itself the creator of the methodology of modern science. We don't hold the Greeks' perspective anymore, in spite of the fact that people keep looking back to it as the origin of science. It is not the origin of science. The book of creation is the origin of modern science, the book of Genesis. And if you think, and here's pictures of some of the leading scientists, Galileo, and we pass over him and come to Johannes Kepler. I like Kepler because of his comment on mathematics. The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. And Isaac Newton was also a believer in God. The great pioneers of modern science all believed in God. That's a historical fact, and it is very interesting to ask why. And the answer that is given by most historians is this, that there's a deep connection between the Christian worldview and the rise of modern science. And it's fairly obvious when you think about it. You see, if you believe that there is an intelligent God behind the universe, then you might expect to be able to do science, especially if you additionally believe that human beings are made in the image of God and therefore possess rationality and can study the universe. And so that connection has been made, strongly made, so that I'm not ashamed, you see, to be a scientist and a believer in God, because I would be prepared to argue that it was the Judeo-Christian tradition that gave me my subject. It fits together. It makes sense. The God explanation makes sense of doing science. And I want to say this now, I may say it again, one of my main reasons for believing in God is the fact that we can do science, for the reason I've just given. So then it's very odd when we come to Stephen Hawking, who's pictured here beside a copy of the Times, where it says, God did not create the universe. Now this is a very interesting thing for several reasons. You see, if we were to focus the problem, there are several things we can observe. First of all, Isaac Newton, who discovered the law of gravitation, he believed in God. Stephen Hawking had the same chair at Cambridge as Newton, And he uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. And here is his reason. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I read that, I thought, how did we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? Is it simply a passage of a few hundred years of the development of science? Or is there something else? How can one man use gravity to point towards God and the other use gravity to point away from God? So I decided to research this, and I give you my answers briefly. Briefly, because I've actually written a book called God and Stephen Hawking. Now, I think that the problem does not lie with science. It first of all lies with false ideas about the nature of God and false ideas about the nature of explanation, as well as false logic. So let's just look at that. If we go back to the previous slide, where Hawking gives his explanation, we'll take the logic first. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I read that, I thought, just a minute. Because there is a law of gravity, that is because there is something. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's a contradiction. A very easy contradiction. Secondly, because there is a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists. Perhaps he meant that. But it seems to me here's another profound misunderstanding, that laws can create things. You see, Newton's famous law of gravity, or his laws of motion, more simply, never moved a snooker ball or a billiard ball in the history of the universe. It takes a person with a cue to move the ball. The laws describe the motion. They do not cause the motion. And it amazes me how some scientists think that laws, or even mathematics, can create the universe. I once asked Peter Atkins, who's a very famous physical chemist at Oxford and an atheist, I said, Peter, what created the universe? He said mathematics, and I'm afraid he so surprised me that I laughed, which was a bit rude, and he was not very pleased, and he said, why are you laughing? Well, I said, Peter, pardon me, but that's the silliest thing I've heard for a very long time. He said, why? Well, I said, let me make it simple. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that equation ever put £2 in your pocket? Do you remember the financial crisis, ladies and gentlemen? It was partly caused, I understand, by some people who thought mathematics could create money. It doesn't. That is a complete misunderstanding. Mathematics can describe what happens. It doesn't cause or create what happens. And we need to be very clear about its status. So that's the first thing. So let's come back then to these two reasons. False ideas about the nature of God. And let me show you a picture of Zeus, god of lightning. And the concept that many scientists have, including Stephen Hawking, is that when I use the word God, I'm thinking of a god like the Greek god of lightning. That is, we don't understand lightning, or at least the Greeks didn't, so we say God did it. And the God word becomes an explanation. until people come to the University of Bucharest and they study atmospheric physics. And Zeus disappears after the first lecture. That's what we call a god of the gaps, a god that disappears as science comes in to fill the gap. And it was this that helped me understand why so many people say to us today, you must choose between God and science. Why is it? Because they're thinking of God as a god of the gaps. Now listen to this carefully. If you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then you have to choose between God and science as a matter of logic. The problem with that is, as we now see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. I'm sure you've read the first line of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe that we don't yet understand. Well, it doesn't say that. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is everything. So God is the God of the things we do understand and the things we don't understand. And Isaac Newton's faith in God was stimulated by science as he understood what was happening. And he wrote his book, Principia Mathematica, most famous book in the history of science, and he hoped that it would persuade the thinking person to believe in God. That is, the more he understood of how the universe worked, the more he said, what a brilliant God that did it that way. That's the way your mind works. If you study engineering and you understand how a turbofan jet works, which I don't, you can admire the genius of the person who designed it. I can't because I don't understand it. So understanding and admiration of a mind behind it go together. And that's a very important thing. But let's come next to understanding the nature of scientific explanation under the heading of the nature and philosophy of science. And let me ask the question, what does the law of gravity explain? When I was at school, physics was not very well taught, I'm afraid, and I thought for a long time that the law of gravity explains gravity. It does not. Nobody knows what gravity is, even today. The law of gravity gives you a brilliant way of mathematically working out how heavy bodies move, say in a vacuum, under gravitational attraction. But Newton realized very clearly that he did not know what gravity was. Now, why is that important? Because many people come along and say to me, I don't need God because science explains. My next question is, science explains what and at what level? Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, said, the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. We have to realize that even within science itself, a law gives a limited explanation. And that leads me to the next concept, which is levels of explanation. Why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat is being conducted through the base of the kettle, and the molecules of water are being agitated. That's why it's boiling, yes. But actually it's boiling because I would just love a cup of tea. Now, think about that. Those are two explanations of the same phenomenon. One is scientific. The other is personal in terms of a person, me, and my desire to have a cup of tea. Which explanation do you choose? And when I speak about these things to school kids, they say, but sir, you need both. And that's true. And in fact, if I said which explanation is the most important, well, in the laboratory, the scientific one is, but outside, for the rest of the world, people have been enjoying tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat. Explanation comes at different levels. So we notice, first of all, that both explanations are necessary. They complement each other. They do not conflict or compete. And the personal explanation is generally more important than the scientific. Now let me use that to think on the much larger scale. And let me put it this way. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation of the motor car. You see, the mistake that people make is to think that the God explanation is a scientific explanation. It is not. It's a personal agent explanation. And that can take most of the difficulty right out of this field. Because the moment you understand that the God explanation is telling you why there is a universe that scientists can study, but it's not conflicting with the scientific evidence and the scientific explanation, then you can see that there are complementary ways of understanding the universe. My colleague at Oxford, Richard Swinburne, said, I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. So explanation is very important, but the most important thing about it by far, I think, is to answer the question, does explanation always move from the complex to the simple, and vice versa? What do I mean by that? Water. You can separate water into hydrogen and oxygen. You can reduce it to those two things. And Richard Dawkins has a famous statement, using God as an explanation is absurd, since God is by definition more complex than the thing you are explaining. And that sounds wonderful until you apply it to him. Because he's written a book called The God Delusion. You may have seen it. It's about 400 pages long. It's quite complex. And I ask, where did that come from? And somebody says, well, actually, it comes from the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. Well, I say that cannot be an explanation according to him, because your explanation of his book is more complex than the book. It's his mind. You see, that's sheer foolishness. And the problem here is that reductionist explanation works very well in many fields. I use it all the time. It does not work when language is involved. And here my love for language comes out. So let's have a little experiment and a little thought to make your tummy rumble and to make you hungry. So imagine this as a menu at my college in Cambridge. And this actually happened several times. I found myself at dinner and our places were fixed by someone else. And I was sitting beside a very famous biochemist. And he made the mistake of asking me what I did. So I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh dear, he said, how boring. So I thought, well, I said, well, I know that my subject is not socially very acceptable to many people, and obviously not to you. But I tried to compensate for that by being interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Well, I said, for example, the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Oh, he said, stop. That's far worse. He said, listen, I'm an atheist. I'm a reductionist. And we've got nothing to talk about, and we're going to have a miserable dinner. That's encouraging, isn't it? So I said, oh, no, we're not. He said, how not? Well, I said, you mentioned reductionism. I'm very interested in it. I know at least 3 kinds. Which kind are you? Because, for example, I suspect you, like me, are a methodological reductionist. You take a big problem, you split it into little problems, and then you study them and hope you get insight on the big problem. We all do that. Yes, he said, I do that, but I didn't mean that. I said, no, I know you didn't. You are an ontological reductionist, from the Greek word ontos, meaning being. Yes, he said, that's right. Everything reduces to physics and chemistry. I said, very good. Let's do an experiment. He said, pardon? I said, let's do an experiment. He said, but this is a dinner table. I said, yes, but it's also Oxford, so let's do an experiment. He said, what is the experiment? So I held up the menu. And he said, well, what's special about that? Roast chicken. I said, how do you know it's roast chicken? Well, he said, I can read it. I said, but those are just marks on paper. Yes, he said, but they mean roast chicken. I said, how do you know? He said, because I've learned English independently of seeing this menu. I said, very good. And you're a reductionist? Oh, yes, he said, absolutely. Okay, I said, let's try this. Please explain to me how those marks carry the meaning roast chicken. And all you will use are the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. His wife was beside him. And rather kindly, she said in a loud voice, get out of that if you can. But he was very gracious about it. And he said something quite stunning that I've never forgotten. He said, you know, I have gone into my laboratory for the past 40 years believing that could be done. And he said, it so obviously can't. It was staggering, his honesty, which I greatly respect. He said, it cannot be done. I said, what do you mean? He said, you need a mind. You cannot explain the semiotics, from the Greek word semeion, meaning a sign, significance. You cannot explain the semiotics of those marks without a mind. And he looked at me, and I remember it was clear that he was thinking that I wasn't clever enough to think of an argument like that. He said, where did you get that argument? So I told him, and here's the quotation from the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Roger Sperry. The meaning of the message will not be found in the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. But then the conversation went further. I asked him what he studied. He studied DNA. And I said, that's interesting because that is a word, isn't it? In a chemical alphabet of 4 letters, and it's about 3.4 billion letters long. You speak of the genetic code. He said, yes, we do, because it codes for the proteins. So it has a semantic dimension and a semiotic dimension. So I said, well, what about that then? Where did that come from? Oh, he said, chance and the laws of nature. I said, pardon? I said, look at this menu. Roast, R-O-A-S-T, 5 letters. And you immediately say, there's a mind involved. Now, there are many processes involved in printing the menu. Mechanical processes. But you saw, because you told me, that it had a semiotic dimension, that there was a mind involved. Why do you not say the same thing about DNA? I think you have a problem. And I think people have a huge problem, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to think about that. And we want to think about thinking, mathematics and the mind. And one of the greatest mathematical minds there's ever been is Albert Einstein. And he was clever enough to see that the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible in terms of mathematics. How is it that abstract mathematics, which is not material, by the way, can help us understand, at least in part, the physical universe? Eugene Wigner, another Nobel Prize winner, said something very similar. The enormous usefulness of mathematics is something bordering on the mysterious. There's no rational explanation for it. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand or deserve. Well, that all is true if you're an atheist. But it's obvious that from the point of view of theism, there is a rational explanation for it. And that is because the human mind is the creation of the same God who created the universe. Now, here's the interesting thing. In order to do science, we must believe to start with. That's our foundation faith of every scientist, that the universe is mathematically intelligible. And my teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge was Sir John Polkinghorne, and he once wrote, "Physics is powerless to explain its fundamental belief in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, because you must assume that to do any physics at all." So let's think what we do science with. And I find it interesting to have conversations with people of science about this. And I say, what do you do science with? And often they're going to say with my mind, but they know that that's not politically correct these days. The mind equals the brain. So they say with my brain, and I leave that. I do believe the mind and the mental story is separate from the brain story, but that's okay. You do it with your brain. Tell me about the brain. Well, the brain, what is the brain? It's like every other biological thing. It is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I say, do you actually believe that? Yeah, sure. Well, why do you trust it then? You really trust something that's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Let me put it to you. Your computer that you use every day. Suppose you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Would you trust it? And I have always got the answer, no. Interesting, isn't it? I see you have a problem, I say to them. You see, you're in a difficulty. You've got an explanation that is a naturalistic one. And it's undermining the rationality you need to do science. And they often ask me where I got the argument. I say, you'll be very surprised. It comes from Charles Darwin, who wrote, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." That is a serious philosophical difficulty with naturalism. And it has been developed. I'm going to skip one or two things, but let's go to Alvin Plantinga, one of the world's foremost philosophers. Here's what he says. If Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own atheism. That's the argument. Now, Alvin Plantinga, as many of you will know, is a Christian, and you may feel he's biased. So let's go to a world-famous atheist, a very strong atheist. He does not want there to be a God. Thomas Nagel. And he writes this book with an explosive subtitle, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. That has caused, if you Google this, it has caused a complete war in cyberspace. But his argument is clear. It's to do with mental and physical. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. The reductions won't work, and in particular, they won't work for mathematics because numbers are not physical, they are abstract, they're non-material. And we live in the information age. Now, information itself is difficult to define, but one thing is very clear, it is not material. It's carried in my computer on a material substrate, but the information is not material. And that is enough for me, by the way, the scientific side, to kill materialism forever. It cannot be true, because there's more to the world than material things. But listen to what he says next. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. So I see a fundamental flaw here. Atheism ultimately undermines the validity of the very rationality we need, not only for science, but any thinking whatsoever. So, if we look at this as a kind of cosmic chemistry, asking the question, do science and God mix? Well, they do very well, but now here's the interesting thing. Science and atheism do not mix very well. Because atheism logically leads to doubt about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science. You see, our question was, can science explain everything? Well, it cannot even explain science. Why we can do science, why the universe is rationally intelligible. And of course, there will be many people here, and I'm glad to see you, who come from the humanities, literature, language, and all this kind of thing, history and so on. If science could explain everything, I'm afraid we'd have to close your faculty tomorrow, because there'd be no history. The big mistake that is made is this, that the natural sciences are coextensive with rationality. They are not. History is a rational discipline. Economics is a rational discipline. Languages, literature, and all the rest of them are rational disciplines. Rationality doesn't finish with the natural sciences. And there are some brilliant scientists who've looked at the universe and made statements that are quite remarkable. Here's Arno Penzias, who discovered the microwave background. Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe made out of nothing, with the precise fine-tuning which is necessary for life, and which one might say an underlying supernatural plan. Now, I'm going to skip a bit and raise this really as a question. When audiences today hear the word supernatural, they say, now just stop. You cannot believe in the supernatural, miracles, in a scientific age. Why? Because long ago, the Enlightenment philosopher David Hume said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And because the laws of nature are absolute, then miracles cannot happen. Well, as a Christian, ladies and gentlemen, as C.S. Lewis put it, the first fact of the history of Christendom is a number of people who say they've seen the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that is. If they had died without making anyone else believe this gospel, no gospels would ever have been written. So here is what, for many people, is the end of the story. It's wonderful to talk about the philosophical issues, but the whole thing collapses if you're going to claim that within space, time, and history, someone rose from the dead and violated the laws of nature. That is anti-scientific. It isn't. Let me illustrate. I have been staying in a hotel in Romania. So imagine that on the first evening I put 100 lei into my drawer. And on the second evening I put another 100. And the third, another 100. How many have I got? 300. And I wake up on the fourth morning, open the drawer, and I discover 50 lei in the drawer. Now, my mind starts to work logically. What can I conclude? Do I conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of Romania? Well, which? Clearly the laws of Romania. But how do I know that? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. The problem with this objection to the resurrection, for example, is it confuses two concepts of law. One is the legal concept. The other is a scientific concept. The laws of arithmetic. When the thief came into my room and opened the drawer, the laws of arithmetic didn't say, stop, you can't do that. They have no restraining power. The laws of Romania would say, stop, you shouldn't do that. But even they can't stop him or her. And this is so important. It's a very simple illustration. But because people don't understand the difference, they think that our understanding of the laws of nature makes it impossible to believe that there's a God who can do special things. Well, actually, in order to recognize the kind of miracle that appears in the New Testament, you have to know the laws of nature. Because if you didn't know that dead people don't normally rise, then if Jesus rose, well, you'd say, well, Jesus rose. What's special about that? But once you know that it has never been heard of before, that changes the game completely. And Hume was wrong when he said that the trouble is, you see, that we're talking 20 centuries ago and people were primitive and they didn't know the laws of nature. Oh, really? This is nearly Christmas time, isn't it? At least in our country. And we celebrate the most spectacular miracle in all of history, the coming of God into the world. When Mary told Joseph she was pregnant, what did he say? Oh, wonderful. What an interesting thing. The laws of nature have been broken. No. He said, I'm afraid I'm going to have to divorce you. Why was that? Not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did. And it took enormous special visitation by God to get him to accept her. The ancient people knew about that just as much as we do. And so, the thinking is completely wrong because, you see, if I said to you, as a scientist, that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes going on in the grave before it happened, that would be breaking the laws of nature. But I would never say that to anyone. What I claim is that God raised him from the dead. God, who created this universe, isn't constrained by regularities that he himself has built into the universe. Of course he isn't. He can feed special events in at intervals. And because we know the regularities, we can recognize the fingerprint of God when those things happen. So David Hume was wrong. And so this opens up a huge new possibility, which I discuss in my book, Can Science Explain Everything? Because in that little book, I'm concerned not simply with the natural sciences, but with the nature of rationality when it's applied to history, like the accounts of the resurrection, and when it's applied to psychology and the study of human experience. So my final slide is simply this. Science and God mix very well. Science and atheism do not mix. And I simply encourage people to investigate and make up their own minds. Thank you very much for listening. Now, we're going to have a time of Q&A, which is a very inadequate process. Let me explain why that is true. Q&A is inadequate because I haven't seen these questions before. They have just arrived. And you have kindly sent them in. Thank you very much for doing that. And all I can do is respond to what I see and give you a possible way of approaching the question. And you may well be very disappointed with it. That's fine. Because if you've asked a real question, that is, you're not simply trying to find out how little I know. You'll find that out very quickly. But your question is real in the sense that you are searching for an answer for your question. Then, much more important than anything I will say is what you will do when you leave this place. If it's a real question, you will start to try and find an answer to it that satisfies you. And that's one of the ways to get on a quest that can lead to all kinds of fascinating things. So let me now put on my glasses and see. There are about 8 or 9 questions. So let's have a look and see where we are going to start. Well, I'll take the last question first because I've just discussed it. Is there any room left for miraculous occurrences in a universe governed by laws written by God? Yes. And I think I've answered that. How can we as Christians reconcile between the two without any difficulty? I think I've answered that. Newton himself had difficulty dealing with this as he was a non-Trinitarian believer that denied the divinity of Christ, for example. Well, Newton had very curious ideas about Christ and his status, but he was certainly in a minority in those days. And what's important for me is to go back to the original documents and to go back to the New Testament itself. And I think the New Testament gives us not only strong evidence for the resurrection, but it shows us that people in those days understood the problem. Now, there's only one scientist who writes in the New Testament, Dr. Luke. And Dr. Luke was probably trained in the Greek city of Alexandria. He, like many doctors, turned out to be a brilliant historian. And he writes the Gospel of Luke and the first history of the Christian church, the Acts of the Apostles. Now, what is so interesting about it is that at the beginning, right at the beginning, he tells a story about a priest called Zacharias who's in the temple and he is praying. Clearly, he believed in prayer. And an angel appeared, and he was pretty shaken, but he did talk to the angel. And the angel said, "Your prayer is heard." And he knew what that meant because he and his wife were very elderly. And they had prayed for years for a child, and no child came, so they gave up praying. The angel said, "You're going to have a child." And what did he say? "Oh, marvelous, that's the very thing I hoped would happen." No. He said, "Look, we're old. We know, like any gynecologist, that there comes an age," I nearly said thankfully, there comes an age, where you can't have any more children. He wouldn't believe what an angel said. Even though he believed in prayer, he believed in God, and yet at his heart he did not believe in the supernatural. That's very interesting. I meet many people who claim to believe in God. They go to church, they say their prayers, but in their hearts, they're like Zacharias the priest. They don't believe that God could do anything like that. And the issue was they were old. Their bodies were old. Could God turn the clock back? He didn't believe it. And so the angel said, "I'm sorry, but you're being rather silly. And so you will not be able to speak until the child is born." So he went out of the temple and he started, and he couldn't speak. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't believe in a supernatural God, you've nothing to say. It's a huge lesson. And I'm sitting here because I believe I do have something to say. Because one of the most important things to me is that this universe is not a closed system of cause and effect. It has been created by God, but God has visited this planet and has given us fingerprints by which we can recognize his activity. So the fact that Dr. Luke was aware of an objection that's made to me in the 21st century shows me that the objection hasn't changed in 2,000 years. It's exactly the same. Okay, let's see this. How can we be faithful to the Christian worldview and to sound science in answering a child's questions about the origins of everything? That's the first thing. There are several questions on the Genesis account. One of them is about young earth creationism. Another is about evolution. And two are about evolution. One is put this way: humankind has been around for thousands of years. How could you explain that we developed so much scientifically in the last 150 years alone? Do you think God poured wisdom into our minds, etc., etc.? If so, would atheism be considered a side effect of this wisdom gained? Well, how much time have you got? The issue here is very frequently to do with how do we understand the Genesis story. And the blunt question, which is the very first one here, what do you think of young earth creationism? I look at that very briefly because that gives a presentation. Now, the idea here is that according to astrophysics, the universe is about 13.7 billion years old. That has been reduced recently, but not by much more than 500 million. People read the Bible and they say, but it says that the beginning was just a few thousand years ago and the whole creation was done in a period of a single earth week. Contradiction. Well, certainly those two things contradict. But my question is that what the Bible actually says? Let me give you an example. I take literature extremely seriously, as I take science. let's investigate it just very simply for a few moments. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And the Spirit of God hovered on the face of the waters. And then there follows a sequence of days. And God said, let there be light, and so on. And there was evening and morning, day one, and so on. 6 days, and then God rested. Okay, from a literary perspective, please notice that creation is not on day one. The sequence of days follows a statement about creation. And that is backed up by the language that's used, and in particular, the tense that's used. Hebrew has 2 past tenses. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I consulted the professor of Hebrew at Oxford, and I checked with a professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, which was a very good idea because they both said the same thing. The first statement, in the beginning God created, is in a different tense from the sequence of days. What do scholars think that means? Well, I quote one. And the one I'm quoting is Jack Collins, who has a full training in science and is one of the world's foremost Hebrew scholars in translating the Bible. So he's got both backgrounds. And what he says is this. The tense means that the initial statement in Genesis came at an indefinite period before the sequence of days. Well, that's the end of problems with the age of the universe. The Bible says nothing about it. That's it. It says nothing about it. You see, one of the difficulties that comes up sometimes, particularly in America, which is why I wrote this book, which deals with this in great detail, 7 Days That Divide the World, is that people want to protect the Bible by adding to it what it doesn't say. That's a very dangerous process. I'm not prepared to do that because I take it seriously, not because I don't. So the interesting thing is, for you who are interested in this question, I'm not going to spend the whole night on it. You can read my book if you want to know more. But it's simply to say this: whatever you believe the days are, it still doesn't give you a young earth. So we need to be so careful in making statements that are not actually linguistically supported. The exact wording of Scripture is very important. So I'm going to leave the rest of that, and I will say something, though, about evolution for the next 3 hours. No, I'll do it very briefly. Here again, there's huge confusion. What do we mean by the term evolution? If I said the motor car has evolved, and I asked you to tell me about the history of the motor car, starting with the T Ford and all the rest of it. Well, it has evolved. That is, it has developed. But how? By random, unguided processes, by natural selection and mutation? No. It has evolved by human design engineering. And for many people, evolution is a neutral term. It simply means it has developed. Like the coastline of Great Britain has evolved. By what process? Wind, erosion, weather, rain, all this kind of thing, and the sea. Aircraft have evolved by a totally different process of intelligent input. So we need to ask, what do we mean by it? And we find that Dawkins and co. mean that there is an unguided natural process of natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and 1 or 2 other things that accounts for what? Now, here's the biggest confusion. In his famous book, The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins wrote, "Natural selection, the blind automatic process that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and variation of all of life. That is wrong. At least the first half of it is absolutely wrong. And Dawkins took many years to admit it. He admitted it in one of my debates to me, if you watch them. You see, ladies and gentlemen, whatever evolution, whatever that means, whatever it does or doesn't do, the one thing it cannot do is explain the origin of life. Why? Because evolution depends on you having life to start with. Simple, isn't it? And yet Dawkins didn't see it. And as a result, generations of people say life evolved. Well, wait a minute. You cannot have mutation if you do not have genetics. So we need to be careful. And a famous Russian evolutionary biologist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said prebiotic evolution is a contradiction in terms. Doesn't explain the origin of life. Now, as a mathematician, I am very interested in the origin of life because in many ways it is almost equivalent to the origin of information, particularly genetic information, and I've said something about that. There's a lot more that could be said, and I put it in this book, Has Science Buried God? There's a whole chapter on information, which might be of interest to you computer scientists. It, to my mind, is very important. So evolution doesn't explain the origin of life. That is a mystery bigger now than when scientists thought they'd solved it in 1953. So where do we go from there? The second thing is evolution means 5 or 6 different things, and I'm not going to go through them here. But the question is this. Clearly, natural selection does something, and so does mutation. Just look around the room at your neighbor. Why doesn't your neighbor look exactly the same as you? Have you ever thought about that? Well, it's because there have been selection processes and there have been mutations. It certainly does something. The question is, can it support all the weight that's put on it? Now, I'm not a biologist, though I read a great deal of biology and I talk to biologists. And I am less and less convinced through reading contemporary biology. There's a ferment in the world of science, and evolution looks to me much more shaky than it did before. Now, most people, of course, go there because, and here's a very important thing, if you are an atheist, evolution is the only possibility by logic, not a question of evidence, by sheer logic. Because if I put on my atheist hat and you say to me, tell me how life began and varied, I've got to explain it in terms of natural processes. There's nothing else. And that makes me very suspicious in this sense. There is no other area of science where you can deduce a great deal of it from a philosophical presupposition than here. If you read Lucretius's Latin book, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the physical universe, which was written nearly 20 centuries ago, he was an Epicurean philosopher, and compare it with the origin of species, you'll find that he got almost all that Darwin got, except the transmutation of species, and he deduced it from atheist philosophy in a very logical way, which any of us could do. And that makes me worried because atheism is the dominant philosophy in the academy. It's very difficult to ask questions about a biological theory that depends so much on assuming naturalism. And I discuss all of this in my book. But now, let's go to the other side. Unfortunately, I meet many people that says, I believe in evolution, I don't believe in God. But just a moment. Whatever evolution does or doesn't do, you cannot deduce atheism from it. The existence of a mechanism that does something is not an argument for the non-existence of someone who designed the mechanism. And it's often argued, but evolution involves randomness. So does my watch. It winds up when I move my arm, completely randomly. And therefore my watch was not designed. Oh, it was. It's more clever than an ordinary watch. So we need to be careful making deductions. And I want to say to you, whatever you think about evolution or not, and I'm not going to answer that question because it's far too complex now, you can't deduce atheism from it. And that's why, if you look through history, you'll find that at the time of Darwin, he was supported, particularly in the United States, by Christians. And you'll find today a number of Christians, very serious scientists, who believe in evolution, but they add God to it. Theistic evolution, it's called. I have difficulties with it. And I explain them in a series of appendices at the back of this book. By the way, in Europe, it's the back of this book is much more important than the front of it, because I deal with those questions. But I'll have to leave those with you. But whatever conclusion we come to about the biological theorem, you cannot deduce a worldview from a biological theorem. They don't even fit into the same category. Right. Let's see where we're going now. Can we know some evidence for God in the universe? Of course, I've tried to give you some all evening. Were you not listening? It's very curious, this to me, that I talk on these topics and people then ask me for evidence. That's what I've been talking about the whole evening. There's evidence in the fact that we can do science. There's evidence in the linguistic describability of the universe. There is much more narrow and important evidence in the resurrection of Christ. And we could go on and on and on. So there's plenty of evidence. And if you don't feel there's enough, please, I can not do everything in one evening. Please have a look at my website, because there are many lectures. In the past 6 years or so, I've given major lectures, debates, discussions with atheists, agnostics in 50 of the major institutions in the United States and a large number of universities in the rest of the world. So you can just look through that. And I'm sorry if you feel that I haven't given you any evidence, but that simply shows that you have to do a little bit more work, and I would encourage you to do that. Does the Bible contradict science? Well, I've given you one example of this. You see, science is a matter of interpreting nature. The Bible, it's not the Bible that contradicts science. It's our interpretations can contradict science. And I give you an example of that. And we have to be modest. We don't know everything about the natural world. And nor do we know everything about the Bible. But what I've discovered in all of my life in testing out these things, I find that most of these apparent contradictions can be resolved, some of them very easily. You give examples for scientists who believe in God, but they lived many years ago. Well, some of them did, Newton and Galileo, but Charles Townes lived recently, and there are many others. What about contemporary scientists? Why are there so many atheists among scientists? Well, it might surprise you that in 1919 there was a survey done of 1,000 scientists, practicing scientists in the States, and 40% of them said not only did they believe in God, but in a personal God who answers prayer. The same survey was repeated 80 years later, and the percentage who believed in God had gone down from 40 to 38. I could name a whole list of contemporary brilliant scientists in Oxford, some of them heads of departments who are believers in God. There are far more than you think. And again, you'll find a lot of them mentioned on my website. Now, we probably have to finish fairly soon, but can I do one more question?
A very short one.
You mentioned 2084 in AI. What is your opinion about the singularity and Ray Kurzweil? Thank you very much. Well, you'll have to wait for the book, but essentially, I'm very interested in some of the ideas. There's artificial intelligence, and then there's artificial general intelligence. The second is more science fiction than anything else, but it grabs the attention of the public, particularly Harari's book, Homo Deus. And I'm very interested in that, because his idea is that the main agenda for the 21st century is to do two things. One, to solve the technical problem of human death by medical means. Secondly, to maximize human happiness by enhancing human intelligence and human genetics and all the rest of it. He's looking for a super intelligence, and he's trying to solve the problem of death. Now, my book deals with those, but the irony of it is this: he's too late. The problem of human superintelligence is already solved. There is a super intelligent human. His name is Jesus Christ. And the problem of death has been solved. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And what interests me is the driving force why people desperately want a solution to the problem of death. Ladies and gentlemen, you can have one. Because you can test the truth of Christianity. Jesus Christ claims that if we're prepared to face the mess we've made of our own lives and that of other people's lives maybe, and to trust him as the one who on the cross has answered the question of human guilt and sin and has risen from the dead to give us new life, then we personally can experience that new life before we even leave this building. That's spectacular. You see, why I'm sitting here is not simply because I've got a lot of philosophy in my head. It's because it works. And I'm going to tell you one last short story about Harvard, where when I'd finished a lecture like this, a Chinese student, stood up and shouted at everybody, 2,000 people, "Look at me!" And so he did. I said, "Why should we look at you?" He said, 6 months ago, I heard you speak in Penn State University. I was at the end. I had nothing to live for. I had all kinds of problems. And something you said led me to start to read the New Testament. And I became a Christian. Just look at me. And he was radiant. And you see, one of the reasons I'm here is I believe Christianity, like many things in science, is testable. You can see if it works or not. And when I see again and again people who are maybe in despair, a student on the verge of suicide, and I met many of those, marriages broken, people addicted to narcotics and alcohol, and then I meet them after 6 months, and I see there's a difference. There's food on the table instead of drugs and alcohol. Their relationships are repaired. I say, "What happened to you?" And they may say something like, "I became a Christian. I was born again," or whatever. When you see that again and again, you add 2 and 2 and you get 4. It actually works. And you can make that experiment as well. The thing to do is to start reading, say, the Gospel of John in the New Testament, and ask God to show you if there's any truth in this or not. Those that seek will find. Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. You are unstoppable. Thank you. I've been told that we received lots of other questions, so it's obvious we cannot answer all of them tonight. But I will give you an option. So I will address you some words in Romanian now, at the end of our time tonight. Am primit multe întrebări și bineînțeles că nu le puteam răspunde tuturor, dar există contexte și locuri unde întrebările astea se ridică și își găsesc răspuns. Tocmai de-aia Crisolis, organizatorul acestui eveniment în această seară, nu a ajuns aici din întâmplare să îl avem pe profesorul Lennox să dezbată pe o temă atât de interesantă. De mai mulți ani de zile ne întâlnim cu oameni isteți care ridică întrebări serioase despre lume și viață, despre valori și credință și e o comunitate de oameni care caută și care găsesc aceste răspunsuri. Vreau să spun doar câteva cuvinte despre Crisolis și despre ce putem face cu ce am auzit în seara asta sau cu întrebările care s-au ridicat în mintea noastră și pe care am vrea să le explorăm. Crisolis este o comunitate de oameni interesați de întrebările mari ale vieții, de relevanța lui Dumnezeu în zilele noastre. De aceea organizăm și facilităm evenimente mici și cursuri, de cele mai multe ori în cafenele, în ceainerii din București, unde analizăm aceste întrebări despre viață, credință și cultură. În ultimele luni am facilitat evenimente pe subiecte despre suferință, Dumnezeu, post-adevăr și cum știi ce este adevărat, dar și despre ateism. Sunt binevenite persoane indiferent de ceea ce cred sau nu cred. Oameni curioși sau sceptici sunt dintre preferații noștri. Astfel că toți cei care ați intrat în sală ați primit un fluturaș ca acesta, unde ați văzut probabil după rubrica de feedback că aveți două opțiuni dacă ați fi interesat. Ați văzut acolo cuvântul descoperă și Soul Hub. În București sunt cel puțin două organizații studențești care sunt interesate de astfel de întrebări despre lume și viață. Și sunt două contexte unde studenți adună prin ceainerii sau cafenele și povestesc despre lucrul ăsta, uitându-se la sursele primare, uitându-se la textele din Noul Testament, la Evanghelie și luându-le la întrebări serios. Și astfel descoperă este un astfel de context, unde studenți se adună, se întâlnesc săptămâni la rând, la o cafea, la un ceai și povestesc. La fel și Soul Hub, tot un astfel de context, unde timp de 7 săptămâni mai mulți studenți se adună și într-un context relaxat, studențesc, fie într-un cămin, fie în loc public, într-un pub de lângă facultate. Ideea este dacă ai aceste întrebări, poate le-ai trimit în seara asta și nu ai primit răspuns, caută răspunsul. Până nu-l vei găsi tu, nu o să ți-l dea nimeni sau nu-l vei împrumuta de la nimeni. De aceea vă mulțumim și seara asta sperăm să fie doar un început al unor căutări. Sau poate un loc unde ați găsit un răspuns. Vă mulțumim mult pentru participare și răbdare. Am fost impresionat de 2 ore de liniște deplină și asta înseamnă că există mulți oameni inteligenți, frumoși și deștepți în București care își pun întrebări serioase. Vă mulțumesc și un rând de aplauze pentru dumneavoastră. La final urmează o sesiune de autografe. Sunt cărți afară în foaier care pot fi cumpărate și puteți veni să luați un autograf de la profesorul Lennox. Pentru asta avem 2 reguli foarte simple. Profesorul Lennox are o vârstă onorabilă și nu acordă sesiuni foto, de aceea vă rugăm să respectați, să stea pe scaun și să veniți cu cartea deschisă direct la pagina unde doriți autograf. Va fi aici pe scenă, răbdător, zâmbitor și veniți cu cartea, luați un autograf, strângeți o mână și mergeți mai departe și vă mulțumim pentru că veți respecta acest lucru. Vă dorim o seară agreabilă și mulțumim pentru participare.